webinar will be recorded and will be archived in or on our webinar or our website, and will also be live streamed to Facebook. So as soon as we have those things going, we will go ahead and start.
Okay, we should be streaming and recording. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Integrating SEL into Visual Arts as part of our NCDPI SEL and Arts webinar series. Just a note again that we are live streaming and recording this webinar, and we'll be posting it to our webinar archive. You can also click on the link to the bit.ly that we are sharing in the chat, and it's on the bottom of each slide to follow along with the slide deck and to be able to access it later if you wish. This is really a resource for you to be able to come back to. We've also shared some links in the chat to join with our listserv and our Facebook page, and also our Google homepage. These are how you'll stay updated on all of our upcoming webinars, so you'll want to make sure you follow them and check frequently. Just a quick note, in case you don't already know who we are by now, Brandon and I make up your arts education team along with our section chief, Lori. We are joined today by two very special guests. On the next slide there, yep, we have today with us Maggie Bennett and Nate Barton. And both are visual arts teachers in North Carolina and also fellows from the A+ schools of North Carolina. And both were on the team of writers for the SEL guidance documents that they're going to talk about a little bit today. They wrote the lessons and activities sections as well as the teaching practice sections for visual arts. And they have some insight to share with us later today. A few housekeeping reminders quickly. Feel free to use the chat for any questions or tech issues. And please remember to stay muted so that we can all hear the webinar very clearly and we don't get any background noise. If for any reason you cannot hear or get your sound to work, please remember that we are recording. You can always go back and watch the recording for anything that you've missed or want to just watch again. And especially if you feel like we're moving too quickly, as we want to give you as much as we possibly can in this hour. On this next slide, you'll see a layout of your WebEx features, which is our state-mandated program. So this is just a quick reminder of your screen and controls. Take a moment to notice where you can mute, where your chat button is, and where your video layout features are if you want to see more on the screen. Our agenda for today will include overviews of SEL and the guidance documents, and we will dive deeper into SEL, integrating SEL with visual arts, where you will hear from our document writers with examples of doing just that. And then we'll follow with some reflection and Q&A. Our webinar goals today include helping you to understand SEL competencies, how to integrate them into visual arts with examples, and how you begin a plan for your own classroom. We have created this reflection journal for you. If you'll click on the link that's in the chat right now and force a copy, so make a copy to keep with you during this webinar. You'll fill that out periodically. If you are wanting CEUs from watching this recording later, so that means you're not attending live, you'll be required to submit a copy of this reflection journal in order to receive your certificate. So be sure to pay attention when you see that icon right there of Brandon writing in his journal. That means there's a question in your journal to go along with it. All right. For our welcoming activity today, to welcome you all to the webinar and to our new year, let's take a moment to think about and share responses to these 4 questions in the chat. These can be answered with a phrase, an emotion or feeling, a tangible thing, an idea, or just really any word that comes to mind. So those questions are, what will you let go of from 2020? What will you take with you from last year into this new year? What will you call into your life for this new year of 2021? And lastly, what do you think your superpowers were for this year? So you can just put 1, 2, 3, or 4 with whichever one you want to answer, or if you want to answer all of them in one response. So just take a moment to think about those. Some examples of things we might want to let go of are feeling rushed, isolation, the feeling of fear or anxiety or heaviness, maybe the weight of the world. I see trying to be perfect.
We had a question of whether to do this in our journal or in the chat, and you can, I would say, definitely do it in the journal, and you're welcome to share in the chat.
Yes, in the chat is totally up to you what you feel comfortable sharing with the group. In your journal is for you. So we highly recommend that you do this for yourself in the journal for sure. Great. We're seeing that you want to let go of feeling overwhelmed, let go of all of 2020, worry. Good. Things that you want to take with you, the power of art to heal. Excellent. Focus, flexibility, routines, taking better routines and continuing to make art. Excellent. Some things for 3, which is calling into your life: innovation, positivity, joy in art making. Maybe you'll also, for number 2, take with you more time for family, slowing down, reflection, strength, resiliency, adversity. Great. And then what do you think are your superpowers? I see over 160 hours of professional development to get ready for virtual teaching and learning. Amazing. Color coding everything, adapting quickly, prayers for our school and education, resiliency. Maybe there are even things like being creative, adapting to new situations, finding the joy, the fun, or the special moments within even the ordinary. Parenting, schooling, working, housekeeping, optimism. Awesome. Wonderful. So this activity was actually borrowed from a lesson that is a teacher who is visual art and wellness instructor. Her name is Tamara Laporte, and she's with Willowing Arts. And within that lesson, we started with this writing prompt and then created our own mixed media piece of a goddess or superhero that was really built on the foundation of these characteristics that we started to write and circle. And we could either infuse some of these words into the painting somehow, or we could take the piece of paper that we wrote on and tear that up and use it as collage as part of the background. So it was really embedded into this work. So that's just one way that you could take this a step further if you, being an artist or an art maker, wanted to dive into this further for yourself. All right, we're going to move on to section 1. We think it's important. Oh, this is Brandon. Sorry.
That's all right. No worries. We do think it's important to remember that we are stronger together, and often in this time we're feeling rather alone. That's reflected also when we're the only educator who teaches our subject in our building or in our district, but we want you to know that we are not alone. So we serve over 1.55 million students in over 2,500 public schools across 386 public school units. And in those 2,500 public schools, there are over 7,000 arts teachers across the state. Though the North Carolina General Assembly lawmakers create the laws and the State Board of Education creates the policies which impact your job, it is the job of DPI to create these instructional resources to actually help you succeed in teaching your students on those policies. Sayward and I do not actually make any of those policies or those decisions, but we are here to help assist you in any way that we can. This series specifically has been designed to help our teachers succeed when the decision-making process is out of our control. Remember, you are not alone in this. We're also really excited to share about the legislated arts high school graduation requirement from July. For the first time ever, every student in North Carolina will experience the arts mandated by law, starting with those students entering grade 6 in 2022. Lastly, we just wanted to point out or remind everyone that in North Carolina, we teach within the Comprehensive Arts Education Framework. And these 3 components of CAE are independent and were found by the Comprehensive Arts Education Task Force to be completely necessary. We encourage all educators to look for opportunities to partner with their local organizations to bring arts education, arts integration, and arts exposure to authentic experiences, even in these virtual learning times. Oh, I apologize. Everything's hyperlinked, so that happens. Without any further ado, we would like to, we're going to talk about these, what SEL is, what North Carolina is doing, and what these guidance documents are.
Thanks, Brandon. So what is SEL, or social emotional learning? Well, first, SEL addresses these 5 core competencies, and you can see that they are grouped by colors, and that's for a reason. The orange ones are dealing with awareness of and management of the self. So those self-management, self-awareness. The green ones are dealing with others and how we relate to other people through social awareness and relationship skills. And then all of those come together and impact the yellow one, which is responsible decision making. SEL is at the center or the root of all learning, and then it branches out to how that is addressed in the classrooms, and then the schools, and then homes and communities through family and community partnerships. On the next slide, you'll see the most updated definition of SEL from CASEL, and you can come back to and read this in more detail. We're not going to read it out loud to you, but notice the highlighted part that says SEL is an integral part of education and human development. The next slide will show you it's borrowed from the Friday Institute, and we love this quote in red: ensuring that all students have opportunities to continue to see their place in our school community is imperative. Addressing SEL is not optional. It is critical to supporting our students and their learning. So we keep that at the forefront of everything that we are doing with this. On the next slide, you'll see North Carolina's SEL implementation plan. So this is a summary of the NCDPI SEL implementation plan. If you're curious about the steps and the planning process, we encourage you to take a deeper look over this flyer and share it with your school and colleagues. And be aware of the Collaborating States Initiative, which we joined in November of 2019. Through CASEL, and really what our NCSEL implementation team is doing. So you'll see all of those steps in further detail when you go to that flyer there. Part of that is what we as Arts Ed are doing, recognizing that the arts are truly a way to connect to SEL in a special way. We immediately began putting together these natural connections between the arts and the 5 SEL core competencies, which can be found both in brief on the interactive CASEL wheel and then in depth in the guidance documents. We've also started and will continue these Arts and SEL webinars throughout this coming year and into the future, beginning with the in-depth content area webinar that you're attending right now. So on this next slide, you'll find a link to our interactive CASEL wheel for arts education specifically that you can go into and easily click on these little buttons for quick glance examples of how each competency might show up in that area. There are also links to the outside circle to community resources for more information, including your A+ schools of North Carolina, which have played a huge part in writing these documents that you're going to take a look at later. So we're going to move on now to one thing that we are doing. One of the main things that we're doing as an agency is implementing CASEL's 3 signature practices into both our workplace and meetings and, both our workplace and our meetings. So it's a great place for you to start as well, that you can easily tap into and start here to introduce these concepts into your team meetings, your faculty meetings, but most importantly, into your classroom structure itself. You may already be doing some of these things, but these resources here will give you more ideas on how to bring awareness and intentionality to these 3 signature practices, which are welcoming activities like we did earlier, which really find a way to ground the group together and kind of have a commonality. Engaging pedagogy throughout your session, which you all do automatically anyways, but it just gives you a few additional ideas of what you could add. And then optimistic closures, making sure that we're trying to end everything on an optimistic note. There's a playbook with examples and ideas for you to adapt to your own classes and content areas, as well as your meetings. And then there's info on creating conditions for student learning as well as adult learning, which can mean your meetings and your trainings as well. There is also a video webinar that we highly recommend. It's with our CASEL lead, Beth Rice, for you to go into more depth about these practices. So if you're worried about where to start and you're feeling overwhelmed, this is the easiest entry point for many people to start, because it's something that you're probably already doing in your classroom and you can just grab hold of it. We'll dive now into the support documents to give you a little overview on what these are. Part of the SEL implementation team's work led to finding connections between the North Carolina Standard Course of Study and these SEL core competencies. Documents were created for each content area that highlight those connections. It was based on previous work that was done in Massachusetts and then expanded by NCDPI. And then in the arts area specifically, we also had the help of the fellows from A+ schools of North Carolina. Our guests, Maggie and Nate, were on this team of writers for the visual arts section. Each content area starts with an overview of how to use the document, lays out natural connections between the content area and SEL, and then dives deeper into specific lessons or activity ideas, as well as suggested teaching practices that you can use throughout all of your classes in your days and how you interact with your students, that really connect to the core competencies within that content area. At the end, you'll find a crosswalk between the competencies and the standards from that content area and how they align directly. You'll find that you can easily locate places in your curriculum where you can infuse instruction with these SEL standards, because they're already present in the standards of your content as well. However, by integrating them intentionally into our content, we engage our students more deeply while educating the whole child. So on this next slide here, you'll see a quick glance sheet. So don't worry if you don't have a full understanding of all of these competencies yet. We'll be doing a deeper dive later, but here's a refresher of the competencies in this quick glance sheet, which was created by our guests today. It's a great thing for you to print out and have with you all the time so that you can just glance over it and make sure that you're referencing some of these. It was also emailed to you, and if you want to have it pulled up or printed out for you for the next section, it will be helpful. And then on this last slide here, there's a few examples that you can come back to that show how you might already be addressing some of the SEL competencies within your visual arts classroom. You'll see a lesson or activity for each of those competencies, as well as an instructional practice. You may want to come back to this slide or just take a moment on your own to read one or two that stand out for you while we transition to the next section. So we're going to move on, and I'm going to hand it over to our guests for today, Maggie and Nate.
Hello. My name is Nate Barton. I teach visual arts in Asheville, North Carolina. I teach 6th through 12th grade. I'm happy to be here today. We are going to, I can't see the slide. Say, what are we?
Yeah, we lost them.
Hang on one second. Let me see. Oh,
I'll go ahead and jump in. I'm Maggie Bennett, and I also teach visual arts. I teach 6th through 8th grade currently in middle school and here in Wake County, and I'm also an A+ fellow.
So Maggie and I worked in the spring and then in the summer to kind of really dig into SEL and especially making the strong SEL connections to visual arts. And so we're going to present some things that we're doing, that we have done. But we'd like to start, if we can go, I'm seeing slide.
There you go.
There we go. You're doing this, people. I mean, that's what we realized when we started to dig into it. And even as we came back to prepare for this presentation today, we found things that we're doing currently that connect directly and without a lot of work. It's not a reach to have to integrate SEL into what we're doing. So here's something we'd like you to think about. And that is, we want you to just visualize right now, and you might make a note of it somewhere, you might write it down, a project, any project, an art project that you have done, that you love, that you come back to year after year, that you feel like your students respond to, and just make a note of that. And like I say, we'll come back to that as we kind of progress, but that's where we'd like you to start. Just kind of visualize that before we get going. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Maggie. She's going to share some of her work.
Okay, thanks, Nate. So as I'm walking through this, just sort of an overview of something that I do in the classroom, I'd love for you to maybe take quick glances at that quick glance sheet and see if you can start to recognize connections that you, yes, that one. Yes, it's so helpful because there's a lot coming at you, and what we're hoping that you will discover as you start listening and watching is that you are recognizing a lot of this in the work that you're already doing as well. I'm going to present a project to you that is meaningful to me, and because of my students and the way they responded to it. And I took that as my cue to help me go forward. Go ahead. So I also want to say from the get-go that this is not a project that I created overnight. This is not a project that I did once and I've kept it the same ever since. This one has grown over time as my students have taught me where they want to spend time and sort of wallow, and where I feel like they are showing that they're getting something out of the experience. So this is a project that allows them to focus on their three-dimensional arts. I am primarily the 3D teacher at my school, and that gives me the chance to really work with my students in working with their hands. And Nate reminded me of something that he had heard recently from someone who had said that working with our hands is in our bones. It's something that really harkens back to who we are from the very, very beginning. And it's one of the things that I feel like we are losing over time. So anytime we can do something that connects back to our physical self and our physical history, we are shining a light on that part of ourselves and adding some awareness. So as I'm going through this, just see if you recognize things that you feel like would connect to growing in that, our self-awareness and the awareness of others. So I was honoring their need to understand where they came from, but they may not have really understood that history was something that their family carries and that they could share with each other. So I began introducing the concept of the storyteller, and primarily the oral storyteller, because most of the time we've been on this planet, story has been shared through voice, through storytelling, using our voice rather, and not on paper. Sometimes it was done pictorially, like on a cave wall, but it was done with one person sharing it with others. So we started to recognize and identify the importance of the storyteller in communities, or in what you might consider your own tribe. You know, we've been calling people pods lately, and I've been thinking about how that word is kind of like mini tribes. It's when you get down to your pods, you're starting to recognize who your tribes might be. So I've been using that word interchangeably lately, I noticed, because it's a new buzzword for us. So then we focus more specifically on the American Southwest and the storytellers there. And we made sure that they understood that storytelling can come in lots of different forms. We spent time listening to StoryCorps on NPR. We spent time, watching video of animations, sort of sharing some of the creation stories that some of the more native tribes might share. And then we started talking about how we find that history in our own communities. So you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm sorry, wait. This is an image of one of the first clay storytellers that was done by a young woman, a native woman of the Cochiti tribe in the American Southwest Pueblo area. And she started making these because she could not make the bowls well. She could not make the vessels that her family were making for their tribe. She couldn't do it very well. So she chose to try something different, and that's where this grew out of. So this is in honor of her grandfather, who is one of the elders in their tribe and was the storyteller there. And the other image is from the Native American Museum in Washington, D.C. Okay. So what this project allows students to do, and I'm giving a synopsis, so I am sharing some of it directly instead of you discovering it on your own, but the students learn about the clay and clay sculpture, which is one artistic aspect of it in the medium. They're learning about some of the customs of native cultures in our homeland. They are being shown the importance of storytelling, specifically the oral storytelling, and they start to discover who their storytellers are in their tribe. I typically teach this in the fall. In October, I start the project right before Thanksgiving. And many families come together and listen to stories sitting around the table. They might get to see Uncle John for the first time in a year, and they get to notice, hey, Uncle John's always the one that's telling the stories in their family. And then when we sit around, he's the one that's making everybody laugh and remembering, when they were kids and stuff. And so I asked them to start recognizing that. Go ahead. So from there, we start working on building our own storytellers. I asked the students to start discovering stories at home in their families that they might like to share. And from there, they find an inspiration to start building on their own. So for these next few slides, what you'll see is some of the results of their work. The storytellers have certain characteristics. If you look at them, you'll see in the native tribes create certain aspects like an open mouth as if they're singing or speaking. And they often have young people or younger versions of themselves sitting, crawling, hanging out beside them. Any of us with young children know what that would feel like. And they are sitting there listening to the stories. So for the next 2 or 3 slides, you'll just see some of the results of their work. So this slide just quickly outlines some of the aspects that I just mentioned. So this would be what you might consider the criteria for the sculpture itself. It's really wide open as far as the subject matter goes. They some of the tribes focus on more animal sculptures and less human, or actually, I always use that term a little loosely because we're animals too, but other animals besides ourselves, besides humans, and they can have a mix of species, so it doesn't have to be all one. The solutions they come up with are incredibly personal and very individual. I like to give them some structure, so it has to requires that to be these things, but that's as far as the structure goes. And from there, it allows them to draw into some of their own. So the next one just quickly outlines some of the criteria for writing their own story, which is one of many parts to this lesson. And that's why I mentioned that this grew over time. The first time I did it, I just talked to them about storytellers and introduced them to the clay sculpture many years ago. And over time, it's become more additionally a literacy exercise where we talk about what makes a good story and how to write one with these elements in order to make the story fun to listen to. And so I think that's the last slide, right? So I'm asking you now, I went through that really quickly, and partly I put some of the slides in here because I knew that you'd have access to this slide deck, and if you wanted to have some of the resources to make note of, they'd be there. But there is a great deal more to it, and of course I'm always happy to share a more linear aspect of it. But just watching what you've seen now and then thinking about that, what inspired you along the way? What connected to something that you're already doing? And before you go any further, it might be nice to go ahead and write those ideas down, either in your journal or that you were from the link, or on a piece of paper if that's someplace you're working instead. And I'd love to know if you have any questions. I did run through it pretty quickly. This was a project that would take at least a couple of weeks because it doesn't involve just the sculpture building. It's all of the preliminary understanding of the culture that's around it. So you have any questions for me? Yeah. So maybe a project like this starts with helping them recognize that they have storytellers in their world. Where do stories come from? And perhaps I don't know if you're able to work in any kind of 3D fashion, but even if you were to show them the examples of some storytellers that you can find a great deal, many of these online, because they are sold in museums and shops and things like that, and they are in museums themselves. And it is a collaboration that I have done with ELA teachers many times.
Maggie, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, did you do this with clay? Because it also looks a lot like model magic to me.
It is clay.
Okay, yeah, because I was thinking with those teachers who might have a smaller window of time, such as
Yes.
being art on the cart, having like an air dry clay or something like model magic, which comes in, more of those earth tones as well,
right,
is pretty accessible.
Yeah, there's Sculpey, there is air dry clay, but even taking it to just a two-dimensional aspect and doing a drawing of it, including those features, would still take the students through that thinking process of developing a character based on their own experiences in their family or in their greater community. And so that would definitely work. And it is an opportunity for any kind of medium. It doesn't have to be clay, but I use red clay in the classroom, and we just use black and white paint because traditionally those are the colors that you see available in the past. Thanks, folks. So I'm happy to brainstorm more with you separately off list sometime, anytime we wanted to give you more details and help you problem solve through things such as a cart. Cart's a big difference. It's very different than having a 50-foot classroom like I have, so I get it. So we're going to move on to Nate. Nate's going to share something with you that's a little bit different perspective, and see if you can recognize connections as well. And maybe at the end we'll sort of sum up a few areas that we might have seen, that in case you haven't got them in the notes.
Thank you, Maggie. So we, as Maggie and I were preparing for this in the last week or so, I did that thing again that we kind of began with, where I realized, like, oh, this thing that I'm doing, that I've been doing, connects. This thing this practice that has become, especially this year, a regular practice for me, connects directly to what we're talking about and trying to integrate more social emotional learning into what we're doing with our students. So I thought, if it's all right with you all, that I would take you through a lesson that I've done recently. This has become a regular practice. I would say I do this at least once a week, sometimes twice a week. I have this very original name for it. I call it Let's Look at Art. And so I'm just going to take you through an example of something that I do with my students. And I also would like to invite you to participate in the chat. So this was a slideshow that I shared very recently with my students. And we were looking specifically at David Hockney's work. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Go. So just a very brief introduction. I don't go into too much of his details. I talk about him a little more with my students. I ask them that question. As you can see, this is a Pear Deck slide that I present. So my students have become used to, that's generally how I present this in that Pear Deck format. My students have gotten pretty good about connecting and responding. And then I kind of go through their responses fairly quickly. So just kind of do a quick introduction. I did so for David Hockney. I said, you know, he's 83 years old. He's still making art today, which is amazing. I tell my students, I think he's probably one of the most famous living artists today. And then I present that question. He's been making art for more than 60 years. What do you think you can learn from him? So what do you think? Go ahead and put in the chat. It's not too late for me. That's great. Never too old. Yeah, I talk about that with my students. I love the idea that I might be 83 years old and I'm still making art. And I talk about how if I was a roofer and that was my job and I love doing that, I probably wouldn't be able to do that when I'm 83, which I think is great. Keeps him young for sure. Awesome. All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. All right, so this is a piece that I present to my students, and I ask these questions. These questions pretty much stay the same, especially the last two. So why do you like this piece? Why do you not like it? I always have to remind my students the why is the important part, so don't just tell me that you like it or don't like it. How does this piece make you feel? And then the newer question for me lately has been, what medium does he use? So how does he make this art? So yeah, go ahead and respond if you would to this. And I do this as well. So as my students respond and as I look at their responses, I generally kind of read through them and just call out some things that stand out to me. Love it because half typical portrait, half not. Love the colors. That's great. I do this 6th through 12th grade. I would do this with all of my students. And I feel like you could probably do this with the lower students. I do believe these are oil paintings, especially because 1977. Yeah, so thank you so much. And then here's the other thing I do. So I give my students the opportunity to respond, and then I respond. So I'm modeling what I'm looking for. So I do talk with my students about, I'm pretty sure this is oil paints, 1977. I'm not sure what acrylics were like then, but he was pretty traditional, I think, still at that time. I love this piece, and I talk about why. I draw my students' attention to the mother. That is David Hockney's mother. And one of the things I love about this piece is that you can see her pride. You can see that she loves her son just from this image. I love the light in this piece. I love that you can tell that she is a proper British woman, which she absolutely was. And then I draw my students' attention over to the father. I watched a documentary recently, and I know that David Hockney's father loved him. But I love in this image, I think it's great in this image that he's doing something else. There's mom sitting over there. She's adoring her son and so proud. And dad's like, yeah, that's what he does. Okay, I'm going to be doing this over here. And I think it's great that he captured that. I talk with my students about how he's used the vase and the mirror to create a composition that makes this piece more interesting. So yeah, so that's just a little glimpse. Let's continue. Let's look at another. wonderful David Hockney piece. It's called Scrabble. It's from 1982. And again, I'm presenting those same questions every time. My students, I sometimes wonder if they're rolling their eyes because the questions are always the same. What medium did he use? How did he make this piece? I want them thinking about, how did he create this art? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Why? How does it make you feel? This is great. So I'm looking at your responses now. Yes, it is photo collage. That's great. I had a conversation with my students about, they used to make these things called cameras where you had to put film in and it wasn't digital. You couldn't just look at it on the computer. I love that someone said interesting, but hard to focus on. A lot of my students get that same response. This is kind of a complicated thing. It's a little bit too much. I had a lot of students that say this makes them feel uncomfortable. This makes them feel agitated, which I totally can see. I think that's great. Like somebody else is saying, it feels chaotic. Absolutely. Active yet still, that's wonderful. Yeah, so I mean, these responses that I'm getting from adults are very similar to responses that I'm getting from students, and it's great. Like, I love that, like, we are talking about art, we're digging into it. And then again, I go back and I draw my students' attention to some specific pieces about this. I talk about how David Hockney was frustrated with the idea of photography as art, and this is his response to it. He was frustrated with the idea that a capture of 1 second of time might capture a moment, and then that would be considered art. And so this was his response. And I draw my students' attention to the woman's face, and how you can see all of these different reactions. You can see that moment of like, oh, I just got an idea of what to do with my Scrabble piece. You can see that moment of like, oh, I'm looking at what I'm placing, all of those things. I draw my students' attention to the fact that on the left and the right side of the screen, there are windows, which changes this image that if it was a single photograph would have been very, very simple. You wouldn't have known that those windows were there, that those other things were existing in this space. And then I also draw my attention to the hands at the bottom of the screen, which are great. Those are David Hockney's hands. It's actually the same hand. You just place them in that way. All right, let's look one more David Hockney piece called The Arrival of Spring. I will say this, I think it's important to know, like, I don't always do like artists, like famous artists. I sometimes will pull artists right off of Instagram. When we came back from our winter break at my school, the first 3 artists I shared were just 3 artists, a printmaker, pen and ink artist, and a painter. And they were just artists whose work had inspired me on Instagram. And I think that's great too. I think that's important. I love that you guys are answering the questions in the chat. Yes, I believe it is graphite or charcoal. Absolutely. I spend time talking with my students about the reflection, about how reflection is a really challenging thing for an artist to try to create. And I explain why. I talk about how the main reason that it's difficult is because you're seeing 3 things at once. You're seeing the reflection of the sky above, you're seeing the surface of the puddle or whatever it is that is reflecting, and you're seeing the thing that's underneath. And that is daunting when you, as a visual artist, try to think about how to create that. I do think it's important to say too that every single time I present these slides, even though my students know the questions, they probably know they're coming, I repeat these questions. I repeat, do you like this piece? Do you dislike it? Why? I always tell them the why is the important part. Please tell me why. That's what I'm looking for. And I go into how does it make you feel? And the feeling, I think, is really important. And I do want to say this. I think it's important for you all to understand that that is something that has to be cultivated. So if I go back to the beginning, especially like with my 6th graders, students that are new to me, and asking them, how does this art make you feel? I got a whole bunch of, I don't know, or meh. I got, today I got a shrugs in quotes. And I was like, okay. So it takes work. It's something that you have to kind of build with your students. And a lot of that comes from the modeling. So a lot of that, and then also calling out, like I'll have students occasionally that will talk about And I used this piece actually just today with some students, so I think it's great. I had students that talked about how this made them feel cold, how it made them feel lonely. I talked to, which, you know, that's powerful stuff, I think. And drawing me, and I do it through the Pear Deck. I don't put their names on the Pear Deck, so you can't see which students are saying what. But I do think, you know, there's power in that. Like, I think students receive some validation when I say, yes, I do see loneliness in this piece. I totally understand why somebody would say that this makes them feel lonely. So I think that's important. I think those things are important. Thank you guys again for responding in the chat. I appreciate that. IDK drives me crazy. Totally middle school. That's classic middle school right there. Let's go to the last slide just because I think this is kind of cool. It's a little bit separate, but I sometimes will build these into what I'm doing. And this is a parable. If you don't know this parable, it's really great. I won't read it to you, but I'll just kind of give you the gist of it. I believe it's based on a true story. Ceramics teacher divided his class into two groups at the beginning of the semester. He said, this group over here, you will receive a grade based on how much work you make. So the more work you make, the better your grade will be. 50 pounds is an A, 40 pounds is a B. This group over here, you will receive your grade based on just the creation of one perfect piece, the one, you know, incredible piece. And ultimately, what happens is they learn that the people that did all of the making, the 50 pound people, ended up with the best work. And so talk with my students a little bit about that. Yeah, this is good, especially because I use this parable as an intro to now you guys are going to draw 50 things. And they understood a little bit better about why we're doing that. So can we go to the next slide, please? I just want to say one thing too. So what I just presented to you is kind of a snapshot of something that, like I say, I do that once or twice a week with my students, especially the looking at the art piece. And it goes, we've gotten it down to where it goes fairly quickly. I can do that in about 10 minutes with my students. I think it's valuable time, especially when I begin to call them over and look at their work and ask them to think about their work and how they feel about what they're doing. And yeah, so maybe something inspired you from this. Hopefully it did.
So notice how many times you were asked how you feel, or you heard Nate mention how he feels. So that basic skill of knowing how you feel is, to me, when I was learning about SEL, that's as my starting place. I felt like the whole structure blooms out of knowing how you feel, because once that self-awareness is there, then you know what you need to change about it. And that's still working in your own little microcosm. But then once that blooms out and you start to learn how to control those emotions, then you start looking out and recognizing similar things in other people, and that awareness grows to there. So how you feel is such a powerful tool, because it starts you in all these different directions. And so if you're recognizing how you feel about somebody else's work or something you've done, that is the power that gets you to the next steps, and to start, and the courage to grow and explore deeper. And the more you get comfortable expressing that, the less I don't knows you'll get, and the more sharing in the community you'll get, because people will start to be more courageous about expressing how they feel in front of others, and they'll start to see the connections. They'll start to understand that they're not the only one. As soon as you feel that, it opens up all kinds of doors and awareness of others. And so I feel like there's this hierarchy. When I was learning about it, I started to see it more like a hierarchy, and that it all starts from that bottom point of who you are in order to understand and work with others. And so that's the beauty of the art that we do. It can, as small as it be, you mean looking at somebody else's art, you're not even making it, or you can actually be building something, like I demonstrated with my students, where they have to really make decisions about what they want to include. Those are very personal decisions. And that
I would say I would just add to when Maggie and I first started digging into connecting SEL to visual arts, very early, very quickly, we were like, that's not hard at all. Like that's so much is so easily traceable, so easily connectable. I would like to, so I do want you to think about the reflection piece here. And if you have any questions, I'll try to pay attention to that. Or actually, we'll look at that for a moment. Let me make sure I'm looking at that clearly. Sometimes, so whether it relates to what I'm doing or what we're getting ready to do, sometimes I make that conscious decision of like, this is what we're getting ready to do. I'm going to be doing a basket making project with my students here in a month or so. And I'm for sure going to be showing them some basket making artists. We have some local, so I'm going to show them some traditional work and then also some contemporary work. I don't think that I do a lot of connecting as far as like, can this person help me with social emotional? Although I think, again, I don't think it's a stretch to do that. Like right away, like I think of like Keith Haring. He would be wonderful to connect to social emotional if you wanted to like really focus specifically on that. I just feel like the way that he cared about people, his images and what they represented and presented, I think, so I think you could go that way. So I was hybrid just before we went to winter break. We're virtual currently, not sure yet whether we'll be hybrid or virtual. Although I would say I do this activity, I started doing this activity in the way that you saw it virtually, but I know for sure I will do this activity in this way when we go back. And I really think I might even keep the Pear Deck because I like, for a lot of students, that Pear Deck format, especially when you remove their names from their comments, it frees them up. They feel a little less inhibited to share their feelings, which I think is great. Yes, I see your comment, Brandon. Yes, so let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. Yeah, all right, so we wanted to kind of throw this over to you. Hopefully you have that sample activity. Hopefully you have kind of a mindset of like what your goal is with that activity. And then these are questions, and I think you can come back to these questions. I don't think you have to answer these questions right now, but these are questions that Maggie and I decided we feel like really will kind of drive your thinking about how to connect what you're doing, something that you've already done, to the SEL framework and to kind of what we're presenting today. Do you want to add anything to that, Maggie?
Well, you're going back to the thing you wrote down at the beginning of our webinar, but it's possible that something else got sparked as we were working and it reminded you of something else you're already doing. So you could be making the connection in either way. What we're hoping for you is that, first of all, you're realizing that you're doing it. You just have to sort of take that lens in that direction, but that you actually go away with some ideas of something you're going to try. It doesn't need to be the lesson that we shared, but just sort of what was mentioned at the beginning. Sayward was talking about the practices. See how what we're doing connects to those practices. And you might already be doing that. So jotting it down or having avenues, some takeaways is really important for us. As teachers, when we go do something, we want some takeaways so that we feel we've got some new tools to try right away.
I would say too, almost always a jumping off point is connecting students to self-awareness. I mean, I think that's a huge part of what we do as educators anyway, regardless of what we teach. So I think that's important, just to recognize that if you're helping students to be more aware of themselves in some way, then you're doing SEL work, strong SEL work.
Yeah.
And so I'll just jump in again and remind everybody that the documents that Maggie and Nate created have two separate sections. One of them has activities and the other one has instructional practices. So Maggie really brought to light the way that an SEL competency might be embedded into the activity, but then Nate was talking about the ways that SEL can be embedded into our teaching instructional practices. So if you feel a little bit kind of unmoored right now, I highly suggest just going back to that SEL guidance document and taking a look at some of those practices that they've outlined. And really, if you want to start with self-awareness, which I think it's exactly what they're saying, it's perfect. It's what we think, and how we're going to approach and connect to the world. Then really dive into that section and figure out how you might create something as well. Or what Nate and Maggie are saying is think about an activity that your kids love and which SEL competency are you already sort of flirting with that you can really bring in and make intentional. And so that's what these steps really outline for you in their document.
Yeah, for example, with Maggie's lesson that she shared, obviously you're talking about identity and self-awareness, but then there's so much about social awareness with the storytelling and relationship skills and how people interact and communicate. So it almost touches on all of the competencies. You can definitely see, where they come in. And so making that intentionality really helps students to kind of see all of those things come to light.
I do want to add that learning about your personal history helps you understand yourself. And also learning that you're part of this larger community with all sharing a similar history. So that branches it out a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like you've got self-awareness, relationship skills, social awareness. You're hitting 3 of them all at the same time. That's really awesome. Great. Cool. So hopefully you guys can be able to walk away with this framework and really dig into something from there. So thank you so much, Maggie and Nate. We really appreciate it. We're gonna just give everyone, I feel like we've sort of had some questions and answers, but if you have more questions, please drop them into the chat and we'll stay on just for a few minutes at the end to allow some time for questions. So in your reflection document, you have an area for this as well, but as part of our 3 signature practices, another way to engage with everyone is to go ahead and have an optimistic closure. So looking at 2021, if you can think of 2 things you're excited about, we were thinking about from this webinar, but I suppose it could be from all of 2021. 0 is something that you will stop doing. You're going to put a stop, no more of that. And then the second 2 is 2 things that you'll keep doing with purpose. And then the number 1 is, what's your first step after this webinar? I know we gave you a ton of resources and a ton of stuff, and it can be like drinking from a fire hose. So number 1, what is that very first step? You can feel free to just answer one of those in the chat, or if you'd like to share all of them in the chat, you're welcome to, but definitely do take a minute to reflect on all 4 of those components in your reflection journal.
Great. And while you're thinking about that reflection, putting it in your journal or sharing any of that in the chat with us, which is wonderful and helpful, we're going to also make sure that you get your link to the survey that you need to fill out for your certificate. Reminder that if you are watching this webinar later in the recording, you'll need to also upload a copy of your reflection journal in order to get that certificate. All right, we see lots of great things. I will stop working to the point of burnout. Meeting my new students this week. Great. 2 things I will keep doing: visual journals and pear deck discussions. Stop drinking coffee. Excellent. Pear deck and converting 2D to 3D. 2 things I'm excited about: potential for the restoration of normalcy and peace. First step will be to make time for students when they need me. Keep making connections with these students who desperately need the outlet of art to express themselves. Stop doubting my skills and knowledge. Excellent. Looking into ways that I'm already using self-awareness in my lessons and ways to be more intentional about using it. exactly spot on, because you all are already doing these things. They're already throughout your lessons and what you're teaching. Just being aware, bringing intentionality to it and saying, yes, this is what I'm teaching right now in this lesson, can bring so much more meaning to what you're already doing an amazing job with.
Moreover, we'll just say that then because this is a statewide initiative in every single content area, when students are engaging in self-awareness in a different content, they'll go, oh, we did this in art, right? And so they'll already know how to engage with self-awareness through these practices that we're doing.
You're going to start hearing about this throughout all content areas. So you're definitely hearing about it more right now with us, but it's going to definitely be across the board. So you all are going to get a great head start on everything. Awesome. I see giving kids as much positive feedback as I can to improve their work. Also know that I see them, hear them, and value them. Excellent. Well, we hope that you all had a wonderful afternoon and have gotten off to a great start for this school year. Hang in there. We appreciate all that you are doing, and we are here for you if you need anything. Please don't hesitate to reach out. That's what we're here for. If you have any other questions for us or for Nate or Maggie, feel free to stay on for a few more minutes and ask us. Other than that, thank you so much. And we really enjoyed having you all here with us today.